Showing on Law Weekly, a conversation with an academic and legal practitioner, Dr. Badejo. We also have the views of some lawyers on the refusal of President Muhammadu Buhari to give accent to the Electoral Act Amendment Bill, plus our recap of the top trending stories from the courtrooms. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Shola Shieli. Ahead of the 2019 elections, we look yet again at issues of leadership and good governance. My guest, Dr. Badejo, has extensive experience in academics at the University of California, Los Angeles, and University of Lagos, Nigeria. He has also dedicated almost 24 years of his life to working with the UN. Amongst other things, he consults for governments, corporate and international organizations, and others on issues of good governance, including rule of law, and in particular corruption, as well as on the management of conflicts. I began this interview with his thoughts on the calls in some quarters for restructuring ahead of the 2019 general elections.
I think that the issue of restructuring is being talked about in a way that is a little bit unclear as to what do people mean by restructuring. It has meant different things to different people. However, for me, it's strange that when we are talking about restructuring, we are not looking at the fact that none of the 36 states is corruption-free. Now, whether you want to reduce it to the 6 zones, or you want to create more states as people are arguing, the main thing to focus on is really corruption. Because if you can show me a state amongst the 36 that is clear away from corruption, then I can start talking about, okay, maybe if you have more resources in the hands of the states and as a result, the lot of the people will be by far better. So I think that our focus should be on how do we minimize the cost of governance? How do we ensure that the money that is distributed to whatever levels of government you are talking about is appropriately well spent? Yes, you can use fiscal federalism to reduce what is in the hands of the central government and the responsibilities that you have allotted to the central government. There is no doubt that things got out of hand because of the military rule that we had, which allowed people to have, allowed a situation in which we became more and more centrist compared to what we had before. But we cannot go back to what we had before if we don't address the question of leadership.
You talked about corruption, so let's talk about corruption, and because it's one of the issues that this present administration came into on the back of we're going to fight corruption and all of that. It seems like you've given a vote of no confidence on the issue of corruption because it's pervasive in all the 36 states, as you mentioned. But what do you think that we can do better with tackling? How do you think we can better tackle this issue of corruption?
Well, corruption is a very big issue. Perhaps if you were to ask me what is the main problem that we face in Nigeria, I would say corruption, even though I could be forced to consider leadership. But you cannot talk about one without looking at the other. The tendency is to look at the government and talk that once anything that goes on between the citizen and the government is corrupt. We have to go beyond that. We have to look at what is happening between the people and the private sector, the so-called private sector. I'm not talking about they having to get licenses from government or whatever. I'm talking about when a citizen is going to the bank, a private entity, and is wanting to get a loan. And then the bank manager is taking a portion of that loan before he gets the facility, or she gets the facility. And I can point to that in many aspects of our lives. But corruption does not end there. You also have to look at the social level. And I see a lot of what is happening in the religious entities in the country, especially the Pentecostal churches of the different ones as serious, much more serious corruption than what you even face in the private sector. So it's not just the government, but when you're now looking at the government, the private sector, and the social sector overall, you also need to be concerned about how we organize ourselves. The question of nepotism. Nepotism, people tend to push away when you're talking about corruption, but it is a fundamental part of corruption, and I think it's a major problem that's even in our constitution, because if our constitution is talking about federal character, you have to look at how many, not the merit, you have to look at how many ministers have been appointed from which state. Of course, the idea was to try to spread, but at the same time, the focus on my state, I'm representing my state, means somebody from my state also is entitled to come to me to say, I may not be qualified, but I am from the same state with you, my own entitlements also. So all this borders on nepotism. For me, to fight corruption is more than a focus on what EFCC, ICPC, and the police do or they do not do. It is to try to take the problem of corruption at a very holistic level and go beyond just punishment. Punishment, the punitive approach is necessary, but we see that it has not worked. Nobody is scared about the punitive arrangement because they are also able to settle themselves by the people you have you have given the state authority to carry out the punishment. Lawyers are an aspect of the problem. There is no doubt, but I will differ with a situation where somebody says if you are accused of corruption, then you should not have a lawyer defending you. A lawyer should be able to defend whoever he or she thinks has retained and is able to provide a defense, because you can assume that somebody is corrupt and at the end of the day it turns out that it was a spurious and wrong allegation and the person really is not. So everybody should have a right to be represented. But the problem is that the state itself should be up and doing. The state should be in a position to wrestle with any lawyer in court, and it's happening in other countries. But here we find out that either people are just, so many corrupt cases are put in the newspapers and in the social media every day, and we do nothing about them. Take the accusations that were pointed out on the Panama Papers and then the Paradise Papers. And what have we in Nigeria done about them?
So what solutions are you suggesting?
Well, the solutions I'm suggesting is that we need to go at it at a holistic level. The present administration put in place a national strategy against corruption. Now, the problem is implementation. Because that strategy is also based on an earlier UN Convention Against Corruption. And all these, if they were put together, you start seeing several things to address in society. Transparency, the question of punitive wages that people are paid compared to what the leadership are taking and going away with. If you address this problem holistically, then you will have less people to deal with at the level. And part of holistic handling is the socialization of people daily against corruption. When I was a kid, if you are accused, if your father is accused of being a thief, everybody taunts you in school. Nobody wants to marry into your family. In some places, they have a ceremony once a year that they all gather and overnight start singing the name of the person who stole in the society. But today, as Fela said, we no longer call a thief, we say it's a money launderer. And then the people start wondering, money laundering, it's just like washerman. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't give the image of the thief that is it. If we start shouting ole, barao on many of these people all around, their children will go back and ask them, why are they shouting barao on you? What did you do?
Let's round up with the work you're doing on the international stage. You were recently contracted by the African Union Commission to come up with a roadmap for operationalizing the African Humanitarian Agency. Tell us more about that and how far you've gone with that work.
The whole idea is that the heads of state of Africa met on 30 January 2016 and came to the conclusion that we have a number of disasters on the continent. Some could be avoided, some man-made, but some natural, and that there is the need for African Union to be at the forefront of supporting regional mechanisms, national mechanisms to meet the challenges that we face, and that we should not all the time be running to Europe and America begging for help and when we have not done anything for ourselves. But even more importantly in the thinking today is not just the question of being prepared, is the question of reducing, to ask the question, why do we have floods? If you know that a place is prone to earthquake, for instance, then you don't put heavy structures that will kill people. You find out that in places like Los Angeles, they use wood for much of the housing, and they only plaster the outside of the wood. Things that you can do to reduce disasters, to make sure that not many people die. So the whole idea is to come up with the steps to be taken to have such an organization that will then be in a position to look at these different issues, humanitarian and the nexus between it and the question of disaster reduction that I was talking about.
How far has the work of the...
Well, gone reasonably far because I've been at it now for about 2.5 months. I am expected to travel widely to consult many of the regional mechanisms on the continent of Africa, and to also look at some of the best practices in the world. For instance, how are the Asians doing their own? Because they have a mechanism that is similar to what we are trying to do in Jakarta, and to see what they have done over the years. There is another one in Barbados that is coordinating the efforts of many governments on advocacy, mobilization of resources. And we can, when I say mobilization of resources, the tendency is to think about running to ECHO and USAID. No, the heads of state in this instance emphasize the fact that they will like to have the resources for humanitarian support on the African continent come from Africans. And some of this has been happening. For instance, when there was Ebola in West Africa, the chairman of the African Union called a number of highly netted individuals. Don't ask me how they got their money, but she was able to speak to them and got a little of the money that they contributed, and that was used to mobilize efforts to support the West African efforts and governments in West Africa to handle the problem of Ebola. So it is being hoped that we will have many of these people, I cannot, putting money back into the system, aside from several things that are put in place now to raise resources. There is an Africa Risk Capacity, which has an insurance arrangement, which insurance arrangement is meant to address disasters that have happened. And if governments have been contributing gently over time paying into that insurance. Then if they have drought, flood, or any of those major things, you go back and call the insurance company, which is an African Union entity also, to come to the rescue.